on both of these pots. And so I just want to show a couple things that I did after the demo to kind of finish them up. I don't know if you all remember, but I transferred a big swath onto this cup, and it was all down along the edges. And after it had dried to like a nice stiff leather hard, I took my my metal rib and I scraped all of the slip off of this bottom section so that I had a really clean ending to the transfer as the form changed, and then I smoothed it with a sponge. I did the same on the rim of this bowl so that the rim does not have any messy slip, so I gave it kind of a nice finish, right? So you can, once the slip and everything sets up, you can scrape it away from the surface and kind of clean things if you want. You can also allow it to be messy. I just wanted to kind of give that thought as sort of a coming back at a drier point to finish your edges if you want to.
And with the line that's on the inside is cut paper?
Yes, so this was newsprint resist that was laid down, and then the monoprint over it, and then I peeled it off. And then what I've done with this for today's demo is I've added wax to the top of it. And the reason I've done that is because what if you want to do some line work design, but you have information already on the pot that you don't want to ruin. So what I'm doing is I'm laying the wax down to protect what's already there, and then I'm gonna carve back through it, and I'm gonna inlay into that some color, and I'll show you how to do that. But there's two different sort of techniques with inlay that you can do, and one is where you inlay directly into carved lines in the clay, and the other is where you lay wax down first. And one is gonna give you color contrast with the clay and the color you inlay, and the other is gonna give you color contrast with the color you inlay and whatever was already going on when you put the wax down, right? So it can be busier in the background. So I'll demonstrate both of those things. Okay, I'm also just gonna pass this cup around and just check out, I came in with a carving tool and I just did some random kind of carved accentuation of the monoprint transfer on there, so you can come back in on top of what you've laid down, and you can play around then with carving. Hi Colin, welcome. To just accent what your design is. Okay, how many of you feel nervous about like drawing something on a pot? Yeah, great, cool, me too, regularly. So a really great, I'm gonna show you a technique to transfer images using tracing paper in case you have something that you specifically want to put on your pot, but you don't really want to freehand it. So if you have tracing paper and you have any kind of, love coloring books for this, like I have all sorts of kind of books of really great resources that I pull from for designs and for different kind of plants. You're welcome to dig through these if you're interested in them. All I did was I laid this tracing paper down over the, I've lost my page now because I pulled it out. Oh, I think that was it. Over the thistles here in this design. So now I have this thistle design that I've traced. And part of the reason that I really love having tracing paper is I can then rip or cut the tracing paper design into a smaller piece so that I can see how it fits, especially into an interior like curve, right? So a big page wouldn't really work very well for this, but I can think about layout and I can think, okay, this has a little bit of a curve to it and I like that, and I kind of want the curve to go around the curve of the bowl, right? So there's a couple options here. There's a side that I've put the pencil on, and then there's the back side. So if I lay the side with the pencil on it, face down, and then I take a soft red rib, and I'm doing this against foam, I can burnish this tracing paper, and I will start to get a transfer of some of the pencil graphite onto the pot. However, it is moisture dependent. So if your clay, like mine is a little on the dry side, yeah, it's transferring a tiny bit, but like hardly at all, because this is dry leather hard. So you can sort of see where it's starting to transfer there. If this were more leather hard, the graphite would just pretty much transfer immediately, and I could just do a direct burnishing to get it onto the pot. But the other thing that I can do, if my pot's too hard, is I can find the back side. So this is the front with the pencil on it. On the back side, I can color with pencil really thoroughly. So what I'm doing is making a really strong layer of graphite on the back side of my image. And then I'm gonna place the image and I'm gonna retrace it. And the pressure of the tracing is what's gonna transfer graphite. So pencil burns out in the kiln, so it's a great thing to use. You can either draw directly on your pot or you can use this method. So now I have my image on the front and then lots of pencil graphite on the back. And then I'm gonna lay this in here and I'm gonna retrace it with my pencil on the front side. And I've laid it with the graphite sketchy side down. And as I press onto my tracing paper and I recolor my image or retrace my image, the pressure is gonna make the pencil transfer over. And for the sake of our purposes, I'm not gonna spend a ton of time transferring this whole thing, but see how much clearer that graphite is because of that direct pressure. So you can go through and just retrace your image and you can transfer it really neatly into your bowl. And I would highly recommend not doing what I did and pulling it off partway through, because then it's gonna be really hard to find where you were. But we'll just freehand the rest of it. So this is a way to make a direct image more accessible on your piece. Okay, now I want to talk about tools and moisture content. So my favorite tools for Mishima, for inlay, are just a really sharp pin tool. You can see this comes to a pretty narrow point. And then also a really thin kind of X-Acto type blade. They're going to be really different for different purposes. I use the pin tool for more organic lines that have curves to them because it's just a needle. And I use the X-Acto blade for more straight lines and more geometric shapes that don't have a lot of complexity. And I use the X-Acto blade when I'm working in wax, and I'll talk about why when that time comes. And then my pot is really quite solid, hard leather hard. And this is important for a few reasons. You can see that it's almost starting to change color right at the rim, right? It's just before that moment. And the reason is the softer your clay is, the easier it is to carve deeply, right? Your tool just sinks in. And the softer your clay is, the more you get these burrs when you carve. And the burrs are annoying to clean up later, and also it just leads to the potential for more gunking up of your design. So I have learned through trial and error that I'm working on my pot now when it's at a really fragile state. It's getting to its most fragile state. So always work on foam. Hello, hello. Always work on foam. Always have support, right? So if I'm gonna be carving on this side of the bowl, I'm laying it down so there's support underneath where my pressure is. If I were gonna be, I wouldn't wanna be pressing against nothing because I could very easily crack it. So, and then feel free to come close if you want. I don't know if you'll be able to see this very well from far over there, but when I start to carve into the clay, you can see that there's tons of little burrs that come off as I carve, but because the clay is pretty dry, if I want to, I can brush them with my hand and they will come right off. If the clay were wet, I would brush them and they would just go back down and refill the lines. So moisture content, the drier it is, the easier it's gonna be to carve a clean design. However, if it's bone dry, you'll get these little shattery edges. And you won't have a single line. It'll be like this, it will be jagged, your carving. And so it's a super delicate balance. I would say err on the side of too wet rather than too dry at first, and then over time, you'll kind of get a feel for it. And if you're at all worried about the wetness, just don't wipe away the burrs. So it takes practice, but as you're carving, it can be kind of hard to see what's happening. Just look as best you can and leave the burrs where they are. And that's gonna give you sort of your best clean line success. I'll come back in when this pot is bone dry, and that's when I'll clean up the burrs, and that's what's gonna help me have like a pretty clean line quality in my inlay. Otherwise, you'll end up with partial lines and like gaps in your image where your clay has filled back in your carvings.
So this other pot that you did earlier, is that the same kind of carving that you did?
Yes,
Okay.
this right here is. And you can see that there's some little bits of burrs and stuff, but not a ton because it was pretty darn dry when I carved it. These edges even have the beginnings of that shattery, jagged quality to them because it was drier than this when I carved it.
But you use that same tool?
Yes, I use that
Okay.
same tool. And then, so because I know this is pretty close to bone dry, I feel safe coming in with a stiff paintbrush and sort of cleaning out my lines because the little burrs are not well attached, and I can clean them out into water. And now I can see pretty clearly the design that I've already carved and what else I might need to add. These stripes on the outside I carved earlier in the day when the pot was wetter and the burrs are really clinging to the edges a lot more. And it's so tempting to want to clean it up, but don't. And let it be. So I'm gonna let
Even
this,
now?
for now, let it be.
Even now?
We can clean it up pretty soon, but right after you've carved it, don't.
No.
You want it to be bone dry. And this is getting close, but it's not totally.
Okay.
And I'll show you what happens when you clean it up early.
Oh, I know what happens.
Yeah, okay, totally. So I'm going to let this one be sort of a half-finished drawing for the purposes of our demo, and I'm gonna come over and talk about carving through the wax. So we're doing two things simultaneously, right? We're gonna be inlaying directly onto clay, and we're gonna be inlaying through wax, and I'm gonna kind of walk them through the steps together. So with wax, you can see that it's shiny in there where I've put the wax. I have only wax over this section here that has these grass shapes, and what I'm planning to do is add detail just in the area that was resisted where I have just bare clay. I could also add detail in other places, but I like the idea of these grass shapes being a frame for a different visual language than the slip. So I'm kind of playing off of the choices I made before. And when you have wax, if you carve through it with a straight line tool, like an X-Acto knife, let me see if I can do this while sort of facing towards you all. It's really way easier to pull towards yourself than to push away, so that's why I'm trying to angle things. So what I'm gonna do with the X-Acto knife is I'm gonna cut down through the wax, and I'm just outlining each grass blade. So you can see the first lines there. And what's important is that it's deep enough to go through the layer of wax and into the clay. And you can kind of feel it because the wax feels a little slippery under your tool, and as soon as you hit clay, there's a grab, right, of that little bit of clay friction.
And it doesn't have to be very wide.
No, you want it to be thin.
Okay.
The narrower the better, because the wider it is, the easier it is to kind of, and I'll show you
To
this,
blur the line.
to blur the line, and also to pull at the edges of the wax and sort of lift the wax off. And that's why I don't use a round tipped tool in the wax, because when I do, I usually end up ripping the edges of the wax. And I'm going to show you, I'm carving with the pin tool on this one and with the X-Acto blade on the other one, and then you can sort of see what happens. And how the thinness of the X-Acto blade does less to disturb the edges of the wax. Do you see how many burrs there are on the middle one? So that means that I'm gonna have little jagged edges, and because this technique requires the wax to just, the color's gonna go anywhere the wax is not. So if the wax edge is jagged, your color's gonna be jagged. So X-Acto blade works really best for this specific waxima. And you can get creative, right, about like if you want to create curves, how you go about doing those. And I have found that pulling the tool towards me and having really gradual curves is the most important thing. And then also the other place where the wax tends to peel is if two lines meet. So rather than having the lines connect with each other, I usually start like almost a millimeter away, just as close as I can without drawing them along each other and overlapping. And so I'm just making really simple designs through that wax, and then I'll inlay color onto that. Something to think about when you're using wax is that once the wax is down, you can't do anything else on that surface until after it's been bisque fired. So the wax will be there until it gets fired, and it's protecting.
Disconnected.
Thank you. It's protecting, right? So this is sort of a last stage activity before it goes through its bisque firing. So I think about this as like the foreground and like the detail on top of all the background that you've put in.
And is it wax that we use to do the bottoms?
Same wax, yep. There are some special waxes that you can get, especially oil-based waxes that will, they actually, I think, do a better job holding sturdy. Yeah,
Okay.
but they're not water soluble, so it's super hard to clean your brushes. It's sort of a whole different thing, yeah. So with the wax, you don't want to try and clean the burrs because that will rip that wax surface. So you're going to be working with the burrs. So now let's just put some color in the wax and we'll see how this goes. So here's some black underglaze, basically empty. And you could use any of the underglazes, any of the underglaze colors. I think with this type of inlay, where you're drawing thin lines like I'm doing, slip is not a great material to use because slip has big particle sizes. So the underglazes are going to be most successful because they're just most liquid. And so the great thing about using the wax is that when you paint the color on, the wax keeps it pretty much where you want it, right? It's not really allowing the color to dry on the surface where there's wax. It's only going down in my carved spot. So I can dip my brush in some water and I can kind of smear this black all around to make sure it's in all the carved lines. And then I'm going to use a sponge and just wipe away all that color that's sitting up on the surface, and I'll end up with a nice crisp image. So the wax also helps you preserve the amount of material that you're using, which can be really great. However, I do find that I'm limited in the types of lines that I can make, right? And with the wax, the type of sponge that you use and how you wipe doesn't really matter because you've got pretty thin lines here. And so see how I can just wipe away and it stays down where the wax carved lines are and just comes really easily off the surface. One thing to think about is that waxes usually will start to degrade over time. If you keep wiping and wiping and wiping them, you can wipe it off the surface. So you just want to kind of move efficiently. And so, and I didn't have wax on the edge. So, and here's a place where the wax peeled and now I have black there on the pot, right at the edge of one of my lines. So now I have kind of like a large black chunk. And so that's also a risk of the wax, right? If the wax misbehaves, you suddenly have wax on your surface and a big chunk of color. I can pass this around so you can look at the sort of the lines and how it all looks. Personally, wax is not my preference. That's just me. But a lot of people use it really effectively. And it can be a helpful way of layering, so I always like to show it.
Quick question?
Yes.
So you chose to put it just on the leaves that were on bare clay?
Yeah.
But you could have done it where...
Directly over the slip.
Okay.
Absolutely, yeah, you
And
totally can.
Will there be more burrs when you're carving into slip versus...
No, the burrs are about the wax itself, not what's under it,
Okay,
and more about what tool you use.
okay.
Yeah,
you're
and the
doing a
type of lines.
shallow
All that you
carving.
need to do is carve through the wax
Okay.
Because if you don't carve through the wax, the color won't stick because it'll still be
Right,
resistant,
but you don't
right?
wanna carve.
But you don't need to carve deep into the clay.
Okay.
But if you
Yeah.
wanted color on color, you would make sure that it was bisque-fired first so that you don't go through the color too that's underneath.
Well, it wouldn't matter if you went through the color underneath if you're filling that line.
Right, but if yeah,
Yeah, but you're right, and that's a lead into that
Okay.
you can do something similar at bisque stage.
Yeah.
The difference being that only picks up the texture that is cut away from the wax. So it's a way to get, you're not highlighting any accidental texture. Yeah. Okay, so back to my pot with burrs here. I have this one that has more burrs and I have this one that has less burrs, and we're gonna inlay into these two. So let's say I've got a pot with burrs. I carved it, it was a little wet when I carved it, and now it's pretty much bone dry. Now I can clean the lines up with a green kitchen scrubby, best clay tool ever. And I'm just literally gonna be kind of scrubbing, and the burrs come right off because the clay is super, super dry. Something that I find helps get good clean lines is to scrub in the direction of the lines themselves rather than perpendicular to them. But the thing that happens with this is now I have large amounts of dust down in my lines, right? So no burrs, but now dust. And you know that dust will resist anything sticking. So this is where this process gets a little annoying because it now becomes dust producing. So if you're doing this in this studio and it's not this minor demo time, this is something you do outside. And I'm gonna do it right over this bucket of water, but what I'm gonna do is use a stiff bristled paintbrush, and I'm gonna brush the dust out of those lines. So I have to clean them before I put color in. It's a lot of steps.
I was like, no, but that's a
It's
lot of dust.
It's a lot of dust, yeah.
I would have never guessed that, okay.
Yep, yep.
Wow.
And if you leave dust behind, you know, a tiny bit is fine, but it very quickly you'll notice that color won't stick there.
Huh.
So you do really need to clean them. And let's see here, I'm gonna scrub a little bit over here, and then I'm gonna pass it around so you can see 3 different stages: burrs, dust, and clean lines. And just get a feel for what those look like. If you've carved really, really dry, like this one, you don't actually need the kitchen scrubby because there's no texture, but you do still need to make sure your lines are clean because there will have been a little bit of clay dust. And so if you notice, as I'm removing the dust, I'm using the paintbrush and following the direction of the lines, not going perpendicular to them, and that helps. And I just want to take a look and make sure that they look pretty clean, right? Not super dusty before I put color.
Could you, if you were doing it outside, use
Yeah.
one of those air
Canned
things?
air. I've tried that before. And the issue is that it's, you know, it's like it turns really cold in your hand if you have it on for very long. So you do like one little spritz, and then you do another spritz, and then you do another spritz, and suddenly you're holding like an ice cube, and it's forming weird frozen condensation, and it becomes really hard to hold. So
No.
yeah, you'd have to wear some mittens. I tried it, and it was like, oh, not worth it, not worth it. Okay.
How about a little tiny handheld vacuum?
Oh, that'd be adorable.
I think you should try that, Anne. I think that's a great
Yeah,
idea.
that is a good idea.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
you're
I
not
think
gonna
you're
suck
really
in the
using
dust
your
as much.
Yeah, less work, more vacuuming. Okay, I'm
The
gonna.
smallest vacuum you can buy.
Yeah.
I want a little doll Barbie vacuum.
An actually functional
You can
dollhouse.
get like little vacuums that are for espresso machines that pick up espresso grounds.
There we
It's on Amazon,
go.
it's literally like this big, and that would work for it.
All right, who's gonna do that
It's a
for their
little-
textile project?
Interesting.
I love tools.
Yes, who
I know.
doesn't? Who
Another
doesn't?
tool.
Another kitchen tool especially makes it a.
I know, right? Okay, so this pot here is an interesting one because I have inlay that I'm planning to do, and I also have visual information that I want to protect on either side of it. So I'm gonna be really careful.
Did you put
I did not put wax, but I could. I totally could, and that would be a really good move. I'm just gonna be careful instead.
But
I
you
got
also
some on
carved
the
in some of those too.
I
In
did,
some
but
of the
I'm
color
gonna leave
places.
those carvings, and I'm gonna talk about
Okay.
why I would do something different with them at bisque firing stage. So when I'm adding color to my inlay pot, I want it to be bone dry, fully bone dry. I want as little moisture present for this stage as possible. And something that I think is pretty important that a lot of people miss is that you don't actually need the layer to be very thick, especially if you carved when the pot was dry enough that the carvings aren't really deep. And it doesn't really matter if there's any color up on the surface because that's just what you're gonna wipe off. So I love to add some color and then dip my brush in water and come back in and smear all that color from the surface down into the carvings. And what that's doing is it's saving me work where I don't have as much to wipe away later. And it's also saving me material, right? And so it's just kind of redistributing things down into the carvings. You can see how I'm gonna have way less to do later on.
And the underglaze wipes off better than the oxides?
Yeah, so this is a situation where, yes, definitely. So I don't really like to use oxides for inlay at all because they get really powdery before they've been fired and they smear quite a bit. And I find that oxides work well for staining later on after bisque firing. They work great on greenware if you want to use brush strokes. However, oxides are powdery until they're glaze fired. And so it can, even if you put them on at greenware and then you fire it once, if you then touch it, you can potentially put little fingerprints all over your pot, which is really annoying. So whereas like the underglazes have some materials in them that help them seal to the surface. Yeah, so oxides I would not recommend for this type of inlay on greenware. Okay, so I'm gonna let this dry a bit. You can see that it's like sort of dark in places and a little glossy. I don't wanna do any of the next steps until that's fully dry. Because if I try to do the wiping part when there's a lot of moisture present, it's gonna be easier to lift up clay particles and smear them around, and to remove my color from down in the carved line. So my goal will be to wipe away all the color on the surface without disturbing the clay under that color or the underglaze that's down in the carvings. And the best way to do that is wipe with the least amount of moisture. So sometimes I will put color on these, leave them for a few hours, do something else, and then come back when I know that all that moisture that I added is like fully gone. And then
This would also work better on non-groggy clay.
it works, most people do inlay on non-groggy clay. I love to give myself extra challenge, so I do it on groggy clay. So this bowl was groggy clay, and that's another reason that the edges of these wax inlaid lines are a little bit more brittle, because as I was cutting, the grog in the clay being displaced also rips at the wax edges. And without the ability to wipe away more and smooth those out, you do end up with more jaggedness. This wouldn't happen as much with the X-Acto knife if this were porcelain or a smooth clay.
So if you did it on the section that had been covered with slip, you wouldn't get as much.
Yeah, I don't think so. No, not at all. Ooh, yeah, let's do that. I'm gonna cut through there and we'll just test it a little bit and see. I could be wrong, but we'll test it. So this is through just the slip, and it's a really messy little leaf. But I don't know, it still looks a little funky. But I think it might be cleaner. What do you think?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I gotta say, I think there might be some techniques to the wax that I just also haven't mastered yet because I don't like it.
But you know, a certain, like leaves,
Yeah,
the jaggedness
Can be
could
part of it.
actually really good if it's,
absolutely.
you know, I don't know,
Absolutely.
something else, it wouldn't, but I think that, I
Especially if
actually
it's
kinda-
on a textured surface.
If it's on
or
a textured
something,
surface
yeah,
and
just
the glaze is
hide
loose
it.
over top, and
Yeah.
you know, right? That's just, it's a visual choice and you just want to have it be intentional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so when this wiping begins, having a good sponge makes a huge difference. So an old sponge versus even a new sponge like this, the uniformity of the pores is really important in terms of removing an even amount of underglaze at a time rather than digging more in some places than others. But I find that my favorite tool to use for inlay is this Mud Tool sponge. This is their blue, like medium absorbency sponge. And it just seems to wipe cleaner than any other of like these basic sponges that I've used. So if this is a technique you're really excited about, I would highly recommend getting a sponge specifically for that. This one is pretty worn, but it started out maybe a little more solid like this, but I've used it for a long time. And then the other thing is you want really clean water. So you don't want to have water with like clay or underglaze particles that are then going to get smeared onto the surface with your sponge. This is looking close. So I'm going to be wiping with as dry of a sponge as I can while still removing color. So this is dry damp, where if I were to squeeze it more, you can get a little bit out, but not a whole lot. And that's important because I want to add as little color as I can to this surface. I like to approach this by starting at edges. So I'm going to wipe away any color that was down over that edge first. And then I also like to do my inlay starting on one side or starting on an edge or in a corner and then moving my way slowly across the field of the image rather than starting here, starting there. You want to develop like a clean spot and slowly expand the clean spot, but not leave any mess behind.
So the opposite of how I clean the house.
Exactly, yes. We don't want to bop around here. We're going to go deep. Yeah.
So it's kind of like laying tiles.
Yes, yeah. Or I think about it like risk, you know, you conquer a territory and then you conquer the next one.
And do you follow the lines still? Or does
So,
it matter?
great question. When I'm wiping, I like to, if I can, wipe more perpendicular to the lines because that means that my sponge isn't sinking down into the line and lifting out what's in there. But when you have a design like this, there's lines going in lots of directions and that's not really possible, you know, for the whole design. And so then what matters more is that I'm starting on the clean side and working my way over. I wiped twice and then you maybe noticed that I already had rinsed my sponge out completely. Not just a casual rinse, but like there's no underglaze on here again. So I always want my sponge to be really clean when it touches the clay. And so what I'm going to do is now come in and start over here on this side, and I'm going to do a broad wipe. And so rather than a teeny little dab, it's one big broad white swipe. And it's starting to leave a clean image behind, right? And you can see how towards the end of the swipe, it's not as clean anymore. So sort of like mowing the lawn, you overlap each row a little bit. And now I have wiped my sponge on each side, and before I touch the clay again, I'm gonna really fully rinse it. So easiest ways to get muddy lines is your pot's too wet, your sponge is too wet, or your sponge is dirty. Okay, so starting over where it's clean, and then also these big wide swipes are gonna really help lead to uniform inlay. If you do tiny little dabs, it's way easier to accidentally erase one place and leave somewhere else kind of dirty. So you want to think about like lowering the level of the underglaze really evenly everywhere. All right, so I'm going to just keep wiping away. If you notice that you're wiping and, you know, I'm going to just get us to that point and your sponge was dirty and you're like, wow, it looks so good over here, but it's looking all kind of blurry and kind of foggy over here, and like the background looks a little blue. That means that somehow your whole environment has gotten too wet, and like the clay particles are like sort of coming into solution and like shifting around. And so then the best thing to do is stop, let it dry completely, and then come back again when everything's dry and start fresh.
Okay.
Would you re-sketch it ever?
So
or
if you do enough of, like, if you accidentally erase your own image, I can show you what a patch looks like, and that's totally a thing you can do. But it can be challenging to do well because you're going to end up with a shallow depth where you had inlaid and then the line ended, and then suddenly the full depth again right next to it. But yes, that is definitely a thing that you can do. Okay. And then, yeah, there, looks pretty good. Okay, I'm gonna pass this around so you can see sort of what it looks like. And one thing that I'll point out is that, like up in this corner, some of the lines still have a little bit of jaggedness to them because they didn't get wiped as much. So if your carvings have jaggedness on the edges and you do a little bit more wiping, there'll be a little bit of clay removed and it will smooth the edges of your lines. So you can continue wiping and sort of lowering the level of the clay to get a softer line until the point where you might start erasing. But you can, I think a lot of people end up being too delicate with their wiping and leaving their lines a little jagged. And I think I would just say don't be afraid to kind of wipe until you get this feeling of the surfaces being one. And as you turn the pot around, I think that on the far side, it feels like everything's a lot more flush. So the other thing that I wanted, as the carvings and stuff that are on that pot that I did around the slip, I did those not through wax, but just directly on the pot. And I used like a wider carving tool. I used this little V-shaped wire piece. So I removed a V of clay, which I find that wider carving tools don't, that type of inlay, it doesn't hold the color as well when you carve wider. But if you carve into the clay and then you bisque fire it, you can then add this color afterwards, after the bisque firing, and it will come alive. And I have, I'm not going to show that technique because that's a separate demo, but I want to show an example of what that can do in case you want to try it out before we do the actual demo. So this pot is just a slab that had a bunch of texture pulled into it, and then after it was bisque fired, I rubbed red underglaze all over it, and then I wiped away the surface just like I did with that mountain cup. But because the pot was bisque fired, when I wiped, the texture was totally preserved, and the stain highlighted all the texture. So it can highlight carvings, but it can also highlight accidental texture you didn't realize was there. It can highlight plants that have been pressed into the pot, that kind of thing. And I'm gonna do a demo of this technique and like adding multiple colors and kind of really building a surface. But I realized it was after our kind of bisqueware test tile phase, so I just wanted to plant the seed in case you wanted to test it out. Exact same thing I did today, but on bisque fired pots. On the back side of that, Beverly, is there, so here's a good example of that same technique on bisqueware, and the thing to know is that it stains things that you didn't think about it staining as well, and you can't necessarily clean it. So just be prepared for that. The texture you did not intend will also show up. Yeah,
With a vengeance.
it will, exactly. Questions about inlay? Is anyone gonna give it a go?
Yeah.
Okay, great, excellent,
Where
fabulous.
did you get the paper to sketch on?
Oh, the tracing paper?
Yeah.
Great question. You can get it at like any art supply store. Yeah, like Michael's or Joann's, or they probably would have it at any office supply store as well. You can just get a pad of tracing paper. You're welcome to use some of this if you want to today. Yeah, you're welcome to like take a page or two.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
They also have it at Daisu.
Oh yeah, they have it at the Japanese dollar store, Daiso.
Oh, really?
Yep. That'd be a good place to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
That is. Store one.